The spring she turned 11, a girl in Fremont County, Wyoming, started burying handfuls of dirty sheep wool in her family's garden. The matted, stained scraps the shearers threw away every June, and the ranch paid $40 a load to haul to the dump. Shearing took 3 days, 800 Rambouillet ewes, penned and turned and clipped by a crew that moved with the kind of speed that only men who are paid by the head ever achieve. The fine wool went into bales clean white, worth $2 a pound when the market was kind and worth shipping when it was not. The rest went to the floor. Belly wool matted with lanolin, tags stained dark, short locks too coarse for any mill and too dirty for anyone to pretend otherwise. 2,000 pounds of it by the third day, piled behind the shearing barn in a mound that smelled like animal and grease and the particular warmth of something that has been next to skin for a year. The truck came on Tuesday, 4 loads, $40 each, $160 to haul 2,000 pounds of wool to the county landfill, where it sat in bags between broken furniture and worn-out tires and did nothing for anyone ever again. The girl watched the truck leave. She had been watching the truck leave every June for as long as she could remember. This year she walked to the pile before the last load was gone. She filled a feed sack with belly wool, greasy, matted, smelling like the underside of a ewe in spring, and carried it to the vegetable garden behind the house. She tore the wool into pieces the size of her fist. She dug holes 4 inches deep between the tomato plants her mother had set out in May. She dropped the wool in. She covered it. Her father stood at the garden gate with his coffee. "You're burying wool in the tomato bed." "Yes, sir. Wool belongs in the dumpster." The girl did not answer. She buried another handful and moved to the next plant. Nobody on that ranch understood why she was burying waste wool in the vegetable garden. The following August, when the thunderstorm washed every ounce of her father's $600 fertilizer past the root zone in a single afternoon, her tomatoes were still dark green because the wool was still feeding them. 1 strand at a time, the way it had been feeding them for 3 months. If stories of children who bury what their families pay to throw away, wool that turns out to be 9% nitrogen, and the kind of fertilizer that rain cannot steal mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. The Mackenzie Ranch covered 2,000 acres of sagebrush and grass on the eastern side of the Wind River Range, where the mountains break into foothills and the foothills break into high desert, and the soil holds the memory of everything that has tried to grow on it, which is not much. Semi-arid. 10 inches of rain in a good year, 14 in a generous one. The growing season lasts 90 days between the last frost in June and the first frost in September, which is barely long enough to raise a tomato and not long enough to forgive a mistake. The family had been ranching sheep on this ground for 4 generations. The girl's great-grandfather filed the homestead. Her grandfather Alistair came from the Scottish Highlands in 1962, a shepherd who married a rancher's daughter and spent the rest of his life raising rambullets on a landscape that reminded him of the uplands he had left, which is to say it was dry and windswept and demanded more of the animals and the people than it had any right to demand. Alistair died 3 years before the girl started burying wool. But before he died, he said things that stayed in the house the way certain sentences stay in houses, not written down, not framed on the wall, just present, repeated at supper or in the truck or at the shearing barn when something reminded someone of the man who had said them. In Scotland, nothing from the sheep was wasted, not even the dirt in the wool. A sheep gives you everything. The meat feeds, the wool warms, the dung grows. Even the sweepings, they have nitrogen in them. Protein is nitrogen, lass. The girl had heard these sentences the way children hear everything completely, without understanding, filed in the part of the brain where things wait until the day they become useful. Her father did not farm with wool. He farmed with urea synthetic nitrogen, 46% pure, sold in 50-pound bags at the co-op in Lander for $15 each. Every April he bought 40 bags, $600. He spread them across the vegetable garden and the hay meadow with a broadcast spreader, and the white granules sat on the surface of the clay soil like snow that had arrived in the wrong season. Then the rain came, not the gentle soaking rain that other states receive and take for granted, but the Wyoming kind, a thunderstorm that builds behind the Wind River Range in July and drops 2 inches in 45 minutes on ground so dry it cannot absorb what the sky is giving. The urea dissolved in the first 10 minutes. The water carried it downward through the clay, past the root zone, past the depth where any plant could reach, and into the groundwater. where it joined the nitrogen from last year's application, and the year before that, a growing pool of money and chemistry that no crop would ever use. His mother, the girl's grandmother, had grown vegetables on this ground for 40 years. After she died, the garden passed to the girl's mother, who planted tomatoes and peppers and beans and lettuce every May with the quiet hope of someone who has learned that hope and Wyoming gardening are roughly the same thing. "Nothing grows right in this soil," her mother said at supper one evening in July, looking at tomatoes that were pale and small and producing with the reluctance of plants that have been asked to do something on ground that is not prepared to help. The girl looked at the tomatoes. She looked at the shearing barn, where the truck had taken 4 loads of wool to the landfill 3 weeks earlier. She thought about her grandfather's sentence. Protein is nitrogen. Wool is protein. The ranch was paying $160 to haul away something that was 9% of the same thing her father was paying $600 to buy. She did not say this at supper. She was 11. 11-year-olds learn early that sentences about nitrogen do not play well at the dinner table. She said it instead the following Saturday. On the school library computer, when she typed wool fertilizer into the search bar, and the University of Wyoming told her everything her grandfather had already said. The extension bulletin was 3 pages long. The journal paper was 12. The grandfather's sentence was 5 words. They all said the same thing. Wool is keratin. Keratin is protein. Protein is nitrogen, not metaphorically, not approximately. Chemically, measurably, 9 to 11% by weight nitrogen, the same element her father drove to Lander to buy in 50-pound bags every April. The same element the thunderstorm washed into the groundwater every July. The same element the tomatoes needed and the soil could not hold, and the ranch was sending to the landfill 4 loads at a time. The extension bulletin explained what happens when wool is buried in soil. The keratin fiber, the same fiber that makes hair and hooves and horns, is dense and insoluble. It does not dissolve in water. A thunderstorm cannot wash it away the way it washes away urea. Because urea is a salt that dissolves on contact and wool is a protein that holds its structure until soil organisms, bacteria and fungi break it down, and they break it down slowly. Not in days the way urea disappears, not in weeks, in months, 3 months at minimum, 12 months if the wool is thick. The organisms consume the keratin strand by strand. The way a caterpillar eats a leaf, not all at once, but continuously, patiently, at the pace of biology rather than the pace of rain. And as they consume the fiber, they release the nitrogen it contains directly into the root zone, where the plants are waiting. Slow release. The phrase appeared in 3 of the papers the girl read that afternoon. Wool is a slow-release nitrogen fertilizer. Urea is a fast-release nitrogen fertilizer. In a place where it does not rain for 6 weeks and then rains 2 inches in 45 minutes, fast release means the nitrogen is there and then it is not. Slow release means the nitrogen is there and stays there and is still there after the storm that took everything else. The girl read one more thing that afternoon. Wool holds 30% of its weight in water. The lanolin, the grease that makes raw wool feel oily and smell like a barn, is a natural water retention agent. Buried wool absorbs moisture and holds it in the root zone between rains. In a county where between rains can mean 5 weeks of nothing, fertilizer and mulch in one material that the ranch was paying to throw away. She closed the browser. She thought about the mathematics. 2,000 pounds of waste wool per year, 9% nitrogen, that is 180 pounds of pure nitrogen buried in a landfill, sealed in plastic, doing nothing. Her father bought 200 pounds of urea nitrogen per year for $600. The ranch was paying $160 to dispose of 180 pounds of nitrogen and paying $600 to purchase 200 pounds of the same element from a co-op 40 miles away. $760 a year to move nitrogen in opposite directions. Her grandfather had said it in 5 words. The university said it in 12 pages. The math said it in 2 numbers. She said it to nobody because she was 11 and walked to the shearing barn to fill another feed sack. The first mistake smelled like something had died beneath the tomatoes and been buried without a funeral. She had taken a full fleece mat from the pile, a belly piece the size of a doormat, thick, felted together by a year of lanolin and movement and the particular compression that happens when a sheep lies on the same side every night. She laid it whole in a trench beside the tomato row and covered it with 4 inches of clay. It looked neat. It looked intentional. It looked, for approximately 9 days, like nothing was wrong. On the 10th day the smell arrived. Sulfur, the deep egg rot smell of organic matter decomposing without oxygen, anaerobic decomposition. Which is what happens when you bury a dense mat of felted wool and seal it under clay and leave no way for air to reach the interior. The bacteria that thrive without oxygen produce hydrogen sulfide instead of carbon dioxide. And hydrogen sulfide smells like a punishment. Her mother found the source before the girl did. Something died in your tomato bed. Her father was less clinical. I told you. Wool belongs in the dumpster, not the garden. The girl dug up the mat. It was warm. Decomposition generates heat, and the interior was dark and slimy and smelled worse than the shearing barn on the hottest day of June. The outer edges had begun to break down, but the center was still intact, still felted, still sealed against the air that the organisms needed to do their work correctly. She heard her grandfather's voice. He had said it about feeding lambs, but it applied. Small bites, lass. You don't feed a lamb a whole bale. She tore the remaining wool into fist-sized pieces. She mixed them with handfuls of soil as she buried them loose. Airy space between each piece for oxygen to circulate. The smell disappeared within 3 days. The decomposition shifted from anaerobic to aerobic, the kind that produces carbon dioxide and the earthy smell of a forest floor instead of the sulfur smell of a swamp. Small pieces. Air, patience. The soil eats small bites. The second mistake was chemical. She had buried fresh wool straight from the shearing floor, unwashed, still carrying the lanolin and the urine salts that accumulate in belly wool over a full year on the animal. Raw wool is alkaline. The lanolin raises the pH. The dried urine concentrates ammonium salts on the fiber surface. She buried this directly beside 3 lettuce seedlings her mother had transplanted the previous week. Within 5 days, the lettuce leaf edges turned brown. Not frost brown, not disease brown. Chemical brown, the crisp, dry browning of tissue exposed to a pee it cannot process. The alkaline residue from the fresh wool had burned the seedlings from below. Her mother stood at the garden gate. You burned my lettuce with sheep sweepings. The girl went back to the extension bulletin. The paragraph she had read too quickly, the first time, said what the paragraph always says when you read it too quickly the first time. Bury wool 4 to 6 inches deep, below the active root zone. Nitrogen releases upward as organisms work from the surface down. Alkalinity neutralizes as it passes through soil. Alternatively, soak raw wool in water for 1 week to rinse lanolin and urine residue before shallow burial. She chose depth 4 inches below the lettuce roots. The nitrogen would rise. The alkalinity would stay down. The soil between the wool and the roots would act as a filter, neutralizing the pH, passing the nitrogen, keeping the chemistry at the distance that chemistry requires to be medicine instead of poison. By the 3rd week of July, 6 weeks after the first correct burial, the girl dug a test hole beside a tomato plant, carefully, with a hand trowel. The way you dig when you are looking for evidence of something you believe in, but have not yet confirmed. 4 inches down, her trowel hit something dark. The wool pieces had changed. They were no longer cream-colored. They were brown, crumbling at the edges, threaded with white fungal mycelium that spread through the fibers like the root system of something invisible and hungry. She pulled a piece out. It fell apart between her fingers. The smell was not wool. It was earth, the deep, living, mineral smell of soil that is being built from something that used to be alive. She tested the nitrogen level with a kit borrowed from the county extension office. The reading at the wool depth, high. The reading at her father's urea beds, 10 feet away, low. The thunderstorm 3 weeks earlier had taken his nitrogen and left hers. She wrote in a notebook she kept in the tack room, below a drawing of a rambouillet ewe she had made when she was 8. Wool end still here, urea end gone. July 14, the road had its opinions. She's burying dirty wool in the garden. That's not fertilizer, that's laundry the sheep left behind. Urea costs $600. It works. You don't replace proven chemistry with sheep scraps. Her grandfather used to talk about Scottish farming. That was Scotland. This is Wyoming. The thunderstorm arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in August, which is when thunderstorms arrive in Fremont County without negotiation, without warning, in the gap between the dry weeks that precede them and the dry weeks that follow, like a single sentence of violence in a paragraph of silence. 2.5 inches in 45 minutes. The sky went dark at 2 o'clock. The wind came off the mountains at 3. The rain hit at 3:15 with the force of something that has been building pressure for 6 weeks and has finally found a surface to strike. The clay soil, which had been baking since June. could not absorb the first half-inch. The water pooled, then ran, then drove downward through the cracks the heat had opened, carrying with it everything that was soluble, everything that could be dissolved by water. Picked up by gravity and deposited in a place where no root can reach. Mr. Bechtold's hay meadow took the storm full 40 acres of timothy and brome. Fertilized in April with $900 of urea broadcast from a spreader that covered the ground the way snow covers a field evenly, thoroughly, and temporarily. The urea had been sitting in the top inch of clay soil since the last rain in June, undissolved, waiting. The thunderstorm dissolved it in minutes. The water carried it downward past the grass roots at 3 inches. Past the clay horizon at 8 inches, into the subsoil where it would join the nitrogen deposits of every wasted application Bechtold had ever made. By the end of August, the lower leaves of his timothy were yellow. Nitrogen deficiency. The grass was cannibalizing its own tissue to feed the seed heads that were trying to fill, and the seed heads were not filling well. Bechtold stood at the edge of his meadow one evening and said the sentence, "I put $900 of nitrogen on that ground in April. One storm in July and it's gone, all of it." The girl's father lost his nitrogen the same afternoon. $600 of urea across the vegetable garden, and the near hay meadow dissolved, displaced, deposited somewhere beneath the root zone, where chemistry sits and waits and never comes back. His tomatoes, which had been adequate in June, turned pale in August. The peppers stalled. The beans yellowed from the bottom up. The signature of a plant eating itself because the soil beneath it has been emptied by a storm that lasted less than an hour. "One storm," he said at supper. "That's all it took." The girls' 4 rows sat in the same storm, in the same field, under the same 2.5 inches of rain that fell on the same clay soil in the same 45 minutes. The wool was 4 inches down. It had been there since June, torn pieces, fist-sized, mixed with soil, decomposing slowly in the dark with the patience of a material that has no reason to hurry. The mycelium had penetrated every fiber. The bacteria had colonized every surface. The nitrogen was being released the way a candle releases light, steadily, continuously, without urgency, at the rate of biology rather than the rate of weather. The thunderstorm hit the wool the way it hit the urea. 2.5 inches of water passed through the clay, reached the burial depth, surrounded the wool pieces, and continued downward into the subsoil. The urea went with it. The wool did not. Keratin does not dissolve in water. It is a structural protein, the same compound that makes hooves and horns and fingernails. Materials that spend their entire existence in contact with moisture and do not dissolve. The thunderstorm passed through the wool and left the nitrogen inside it, the way a river passes over a boulder and leaves the boulder where it was. The organisms continued decomposing the fiber after the storm. The nitrogen continued releasing after the storm. The roots continued feeding after the storm. The girl's tomatoes were dark green in the 3rd week of August. Not the pale, exhausted green of her father's plants 10 feet away. The saturated, certain green of a plant that did not notice the storm because the storm took nothing from it that mattered. Her peppers were full-sized and producing. Her beans were green from top to bottom, no yellow, no deficiency, no sign of the cannibalization that was consuming every bean plant in her father's rows. The wool was still there. The nitrogen was still there. 3 months after burial, the wool was half decomposed and still releasing, and the rain that took $600 of urea in 45 minutes had not taken a single strand. One evening in late August, her father walked to the fence between his rows and hers. He did not walk there deliberately. He walked there the way a man walks towards something he has been avoiding slowly. With the weight of a question he already knows the answer to pressing on the part of his mind that is not yet ready to ask it. He looked at her tomatoes. He looked at his. He stood there until the light behind the Wind River Range turned the color of the wool his daughter had buried in June. He came back the next morning early, before the girl was awake, before the coffee was made, before the sun cleared the ridge and turned the Wind River Range from black to gold. He came in his boots and his work coat, the way he went everywhere on the ranch. Because a man who has spent his life on 2,000 acres does not own shoes that are not boots and does not own a coat that is not a work coat. He walked between the girl's tomato rows first. Slowly, the plants were above his waist, dark green, heavy with fruit, the leaves broad and open in the way leaves are open when they are not conserving anything because they are not missing anything. He touched a leaf firm, thick, the waxy texture of a plant that has nitrogen to spare and is spending it on growth rather than survival. He stepped into his own rows. 10 feet away. Same clay, same planting date, same variety early girl, his wife's choice, the only tomato she trusted in a 90-day season. His plants were shorter, paler, the lower leaves had yellowed and curled. The quiet confession of a plant that is pulling nitrogen from its oldest tissue to feed its youngest because the soil has nothing left to give. $600 of urea applied in April. Stolen in August by a storm that lasted 45 minutes, he stepped back into the girl's rows. He knelt. He pushed his trowel into the clay beside a tomato stem carefully, the way you dig beside something you do not want to damage. 2 inches down, the soil was clay. 3 inches, still clay. 4 inches, his trowel entered something different, darker, softer, threaded with white filaments he did not recognize as mycelium because he had never had a reason to learn the word. He pulled a piece out. It sat on the trowel blade, brown, crumbling, the shape of something that had once been wool and was now becoming something else. It smelled like the forest floor after rain, which is the smell of biology working correctly at a pace that does not make the evening news. He looked at it for a long time. He moved to his own row, dug at the same depth. 4 inches, pale clay, dry, uniform, no dark zone, no mycelium, no sign that 9 months ago $600 of nitrogen had passed through this exact spot on its way from a bag to the groundwater. The money was gone, the nitrogen was gone. The clay did not remember either. He stood up. He looked at the trowel with the crumbling wool on the blade. He looked at the shearing barn. 200 yards away, where the floor was swept clean and the pile was gone, and the truck had carried 4 loads to the landfill 6 weeks ago. $160, 4 loads. 2,000 pounds of keratin, 180 pounds of nitrogen sealed in plastic bags in a landfill, doing nothing for anyone. The girl came out of the house with her boots untied and her hair uncombed. The way 11-year-olds come out of houses when they see their fathers kneeling in a part of the garden they have never knelt in before. She stood at the end of the row. She did not speak. Her father looked up. He held the trowel with the dark crumbling wool on the blade the way a man holds evidence he has been refusing to examine. "What fertilizer are you using?" The girl looked at the trowel. She looked at her father. She looked at the shearing barn wool. Her father looked at the dark fragment on the blade. He looked at his own pale rose. He looked at the co-op receipt on the dashboard of his truck, visible through the windshield 50 feet away, $600 for 40 bags of urea that was now in the groundwater beneath the hay meadow. The wool we pay to haul to the dump? The girl pushed her hands into her coat pockets. She smelled like lanolin, which is what she always smelled like, which is what everything on this ranch smelled like, which is what the nitrogen smelled like when it was still attached to the sheep instead of buried in the garden. It's 9% nitrogen. We've been paying to throw away our fertilizer. Her father did not move. He knelt in the garden with the trowel in his hand and the Wind River Range behind him and 2,000 acres of sheep ranch around him, a ranch that produced 2,000 pounds of nitrogen-rich waste every June, and paid to remove it, and then drove to Lander and paid to replace it with a synthetic version that the first thunderstorm of August would steal. He set the trowel down. He did not say anything, but he looked at the shearing barn the way a man looks at something he has walked past 1,000 times and seen for the first time, not as a building where wool is removed from sheep, but as a building where fertilizer is removed from a ranch, 4 loads at a time, $40 a load, while the garden 10 feet from the kitchen door starves. The following June, the shearing crew came as it always came, 3 days, 800 sheep, the clippers buzzing from dawn until the light failed. The fine wool went into bales, the waste wool went to the floor. The pile grew behind the barn the way it grew every year, and on Monday evening the girl's father called the hauling company the way he called them every year. 3 loads this time, not 4. The driver paused. "You've always done 4. My daughter needs 4 sacks." The driver did not ask why. Drivers do not ask why ranchers want things they have always thrown away. They adjust the invoice and move on. 3 loads, $120 instead of $160, saved on a transaction that had never before been questioned. The 4 sacks sat in the barn beside the shearing floor, belly wool, tags, sweepings, the parts of the fleece that no mill would accept and no market would price and no textile would tolerate. The girl carried them to the garden 1 sack at a time, tearing the wool into pieces on the tailgate of her father's truck, filling the trowel holes she had dug between every row. Her father watched from the porch. He did not help. He was not ready to help, but he had reduced his urea order at the co-op by 30%, $420 instead of $600. He buried wool on 1/3 of the garden and one strip of the near hay meadow. He did not call it a technique. He did not call it Scottish. He called it what he was willing to call it in front of a man at the co-op counter who had known him for 30 years. Trying something, the thunderstorm came again in August. Because thunderstorms in Wyoming do not read calendars and do not care what you planted or what you paid or what you buried, it rained 2 inches in 30 minutes. The urea on the untreated rows dissolved and departed. The wool on the treated rows stayed and continued. By September, the difference was visible from the road, 2 shades of green on the same piece of ground, separated by nothing but the decision of what to bury and what to burn. Bechtold came by in October. He ran 3,000 sheep on the next ranch, 5,000 pounds of waste wool per year. Every pound of it hauled to the landfill at a cost he had never thought to question, because questioning the cost of disposal is not something sheep ranchers do. They shear, they sell the good wool. They dump the bad wool and they drive to the co-op for nitrogen. It is what their fathers did. It is what their grandfathers did. It is what everyone does until someone stops the truck. Your garden looked different this year, he said, standing at the fence. My daughter buried wool in it. Wool? 9% nitrogen. Doesn't wash out. Bechtold was quiet for a long time. 5,000 pounds of waste wool, 9% nitrogen, 450 pounds of nitrogen per year, hauled to a landfill in bags. He ran the math the way ranchers run math, not on paper. Not on a calculator, but in the part of the brain where money and weather and years of doing the same thing meet and occasionally, reluctantly, produce a different answer. He did not say what the answer was. He drove home. But the following June, his hauling order was 3 loads lighter than usual, and his wife noticed 4 feed sacks of dirty wool sitting in the barn where they had never sat before. Alistair Mackenzie came from the Scottish Highlands in 1962 with a shepherd's knowledge and a shepherd's sentence. Protein is nitrogen, LAS. 3 words, 18 letters. The entire chemistry of wool to soil, compressed into a sentence a child could remember and a rancher could ignore for 40 years. He said it at supper. He said it in the truck. He said it at the shearing barn while the waste pile grew and the truck came and the ranch paid to remove what it would pay again to replace. The girl heard him. She did not ignore it. She typed it into a school computer, and the University of Wyoming confirmed what a Scottish shepherd had known since before the university existed. She buried it in the garden, and the tomatoes confirmed what the university had confirmed what the shepherd had known. She stopped the truck, and the math confirmed what the tomatoes had confirmed, what the university had confirmed, what the shepherd had known. The ranch was paying to throw away its fertilizer and paying again to buy a replacement. The girl just stopped the truck. What is your farm paying to throw away that it is also paying to buy? Tell us in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will see you next week.